I'll start with my question for you. I mean, I think it's so hard to squeeze a discussion of white supremacy and racial oppression on the North American continent over the last 500 years into a short time frame. But I think it's really important that this issue of racism and white supremacy and patriarchy and heterosexism and race, class, and gender, be integral to all of our discussions in every setting, in every institution. And so I just want to read one quote, and then I'll move on to the question. This is from the scholar Charles Mills. Charles W. Mills writes, "A new paradigm is beginning to emerge across a variety of subjects, a paradigm that takes race, normative whiteness, and white supremacy to be central to U.S. and indeed recent global history." So if we think about the pervasiveness of racial oppression in the United States, we think about the ways, and this is part of what I want to get into and hear your thoughts on it, the ways in which we can think of racism, patriarchy, homophobia, heterosexism, misogyny, anti-Semitism as worldviews, as cosmology is not quite the right term, but I think Matthew Fox put it best once when I heard him speaking with David Corton, and Matt Fox said, he said, "To me, empire and cosmology are antithetical." He said, empire becomes a cosmology. It's a pseudo cosmology. So I could think we can think of some of these worldviews of racism, patriarchy, et cetera, as pseudo cosmologies, as worldviews. And we hear scholars like Joe Fagan talking about the white racial frame. And we hear Dr. Robin DiAngelo talking about white fragility, or we hear Charles W. Mills talking about global white ignorance, which he defines as a pervasive set of beliefs or a set of false beliefs, a particular way of knowing and not knowing. And so if we think of racism, privilege, misogyny, patriarchy, anti-Semitism, et cetera, as worldviews, as dysfunctional stories, as narratives, I feel like you are holding such a powerful lesson and learning for those of us who are white, those of us who are involved in predominantly white institutions or have been involved in predominantly white environmental movements or eco-spiritual movements or new cosmological movements. And so my question for you would be, what, based on your unique experience and expertise, and your interests in the way you see things, what is it that we need to know? And when I say we, I mean those of us who in predominantly white, eco-spiritual, new cosmology type settings, or those of us in terms of how our world moves forward. What are we missing in terms of understanding the African-American experience, understanding the depths of systemic racism in our country and around the globe? What are we missing? What do we need? What do we need to know? What do we need to practice? What do we need to do? What do we need to think about in terms of strengthening our environmental cosmological movements and creating the kind of world that we want?
Well, good to know that I'm going to answer this in a couple of seconds. I think the first thing is to recognize that the African people and descendants of African people includes everybody. It includes everybody, every human being. That before the human beings, there were many other creatures who were part of our family. Many of the ones that evolved to become humans also evolved in the African continent. So we also had quite a few ancestors in the animal world that actually emerged at the same time, or actually over the many centuries in Africa, including the ancestors of Homo sapiens. So we have a huge legacy here that we can recapture as an integral part of our movement. And I would say that the most important thing probably, and I don't know, maybe there is not the most important thing, but the most important thing that occurs to me is that we really need to get the point that Africans and African Americans have a long legacy, which we really need to integrate into all of our studies and all of our time. all of the work that we're doing. And what, this in a sense also raises a really question that I would have for you, Drew, and that is that um, all of this wisdom and all of the suffering and all of the creativity and all that that had gone into building the social movements over the last 300 or 400 years, um, uh, has emerged. And what you have done, I think, in your work, is to take one person that we all know, Martin Luther King, who we also celebrate a great deal, and you've tried to take this wisdom and uh, kind of condense it into and and studying in great detail the thought of a single person who that was rich in cosmology as well as rich in social justice, and articulate what it is that we needed to understand about this one complex man who had such an important role when you talk about uh, the various intersection of social movement that came. So my question to you was, how do you see this survey of the work of Martin Luther King? How do you see this spreading or being lifted up or understood as a foundation for how we go forward? Anyway, so that's back to you.
Touche. Um, well, King is such a powerful figure. He's such an interesting figure. A study at the MIT Media Research Lab recently found that King was the number one globally known person born in the United States. So he's the most globally known person born in the United States. Elvis was number two. So he's a significant figure worldwide. And I originally was interested in his work. Well, one of the reasons I've always been interested in the civil rights movement and racial justice and these sorts of things. But I became particularly interested after I'd studied with Thomas Berry and was thinking about my dissertation, when I would glance through King's work and I would see him talking about the universe and the cosmos. And I had just been studying with Thomas Berry. He's talking about the universe and the cosmos. And so I thought this was very interesting because King is this paradigmatic icon of social justice. And if social justice and ecology are unrelated, then you wouldn't expect to see ecological, cosmological dimensions in this social justice thinker. But there he was. He said the universe is on the side of justice. I mean, at one point he says, in 1956, in the middle of the Montgomery bus boycott, he says, we have the strange feeling down in Montgomery that the universe is on the side of justice and that we have cosmic companionship in the struggle for justice. But he also had a very profound sense of interrelatedness and interconnectedness and interdependence. And he said, I can't be who I ought to be until you are who you ought to be, and you can't be who you ought to be until I am who I ought to be. So I began to really feel that that excavating the ecological, and King also said things like, one cannot be concerned just with civil rights. It's very nice to drink milk at an integrated lunch counter, but not when there's strontium 90 in it. And he said it would be foolhardy for me to work for integrated schools, integrated lunch counters, and not be concerned about the survival of the world in which to be integrated. So I think he has this very strong environmental and ecological dimension that's been almost completely overlooked. And I began to think that excavating those dimensions in one of the most well-known advocates of social justice could begin to show some of the interconnections and links between ecology, cosmology, and social justice, that it's about interrelatedness. It's about divine personhood, divine subjectivity. It's about community. It's about, at one point, King says, eventually the civil rights movement will expand. King said, eventually, the civil rights movement will have contributed infinitely more to the nation than the eradication of racial injustice. It will have enlarged the concept of brotherhood to a vision of total relatedness. A vision of total relatedness is cosmology, my friend. That's ecology. That's systems thinking. So to me, it was a way to integrate ecology and social justice. Is there one last question for Carl before we stop? Because I feel like I talked too much, and we wanted to have some audience participation. So I'm wondering, as we wrap up, is there a burning question for Mr. Anthony here. Yes.
I wanted to hear more on this, the separation of black and white on the land being also related to our separation from the land.
Oh well, I would maybe enlarge on those themes, but I would enlarge on those themes, but I'd also keep in mind the vision that Drew has also kind of helped us to shape by understanding the strength and the grounding of one man who actually grew up in a tradition in the American South. And you know, those of you who have had some opportunity to study the story of the American South, you will begin to understand how central the whole experience of the American South has been to the development of awareness, not only in this nation and in this continent, but also around the world. So one of the things is that first of all, the American South is not an isolated phenomenon, particularly if you look at the African and African American experience in diaspora. We can see that that there were many people from Africa that settled on many of the islands. Some of you are familiar with the Caribbean, know that there are dozens of islands in the Caribbean, some of which are quite well known to us, Barbados or Jamaica or Puerto Rico or Cuba or Suriname. All these places were where Africans were brought and settled, and also settled in South America. So there has been an interweaving of all the experience of all these people. But the thing that I would want to say is that the African people came from many different cultures and different backgrounds and orientations. And once the slave trade began, we found that many of the European countries, particularly those on the western frontier of Europe, began fighting one another in order to get a piece of the action. In other words, you had a huge diversity of European people who actually discovered new interests in the New World through the lens of how can we get some control of the institution of black slavery. So it was through this particular amalgam of people who were brought to the New World that we developed a kind of an oversimplified vision of how we were going to relate to the people. So all of the people from Europe, whether English or Scandinavian or French or Italian or whatever, all these different diversity of European people and all the diversity of African people who came to the New World, all of this, let's say, with this land that was stolen from native people, all of this could be simplified in very simple terms, in which we now know of as white and black. And this is a profound, I think, oversimplification in the direction of a brutality of not only a sense of superiority, but also the cutting edge of being able to subordinate huge populations at the service, and I would say at the service of all of the people who became white, but not really of all of the people who became white, at the service of those owners and plantation created plantation monopolies that subordinate everyone who lived in that particular place. So I would say that we have a legacy that we need to unearth and make very real. And we shouldn't look for simplifications, but you can kind of see how pervasive this experience, of whiteness has gotten into our culture. I mean, I can't tell how much diversity is in this room, because I remember from from the last time I could see when I came here in the 1970s, through 75 or 76. I can tell you that when I came here first couple of times, the student body and the faculty was pretty white. So
It's about like you remember.
what
All
was
right,
it?
we need to wrap up this session
Okay.
because of the next meal. Thank you so much, Carl. Thank you to everybody. Really appreciate it. It's here for Carl Anthony.
Okay, Drew.
Great to be with you, sir.